As I'm sure you've heard, Microsoft have just bought the entirety of Activision Blizzard for a staggering $68 billion. Saying $68 billion out loud, or even seeing it in numerical form, really doesn't do it justice just how gargantuanly massive of a number that actually is. To put it into perspective, $68 billion is more money than the entire gross domestic product of North Korea. Twice over. Needless to say, this is an absolutely gargantuan transaction that very few companies could even dream of doing. And for Activision Blizzard, it is almost certainly the end of an era. In recent years, the company have hit complete and utter rock bottom. Their reputation amongst their customers and the general industry at large is in tatters. Some of the earliest productions ever uploaded to this channel have been me criticising Activision Blizzard as a company for how they ruined some of my favourite games via horrendous microtransactions, treated their fans as if they were idiots, which most of them are, and of course, who can forget the horrendous work conditions and sheer lack of ethics. And thus many of you may expect that with word of this acquisition that I may applaud it as fantastic news. But you'd be wrong. In fact, I'm absolutely baffled to see in forum after forum, subreddit after subreddit, and comment after comment, so many of the public actually being pleased with this. Because make no mistake, this acquisition is not good news. This is bad news. Very, very bad news. Video games have to be played on a platform, whether it's desktop operating systems such as Windows versus Mac, mobile operating systems such as iOS versus Android, or of course the consoles, such as Xbox versus PlayStation. While many may lament at the fact there is no universal platform, ultimately we live in a capitalist system, and under such a system, competition is key. And such competition will often manifest in any means necessary to get an edge, such as, of course, platform exclusivity. There are two types of video games: first-party games and third-party games, with first-party games being made or developed in conjunction with the platform holders themselves and are, more than not, exclusive to said platform, and third-party games being, well, everyone else. Every platform must have a suite of high-quality first-party exclusive games in order to justify itself as a platform. Nintendo arguably knows this better than most, as they are almost universally lauded for their amazing games that you won't find anywhere else. Sega, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, failed to deliver enough games for their final console, the Dreamcast, and thus was eventually downgraded back into being a multi-platform developer. The vast majority of games produced are of course multi-platform third-party games, with first-party games being often very high-quality system sellers, yes, but certainly not a large chunk of the overall market share. But in recent years, with transactions such as the Bethesda and now Blizzard acquisitions, this is slowly starting to change. Quick history lesson. After the Dreamcast had failed, in 2001, Microsoft entered the console market with the OG Xbox, which, though did quite well for a first system, was certainly no competition for the absolute juggernaut that was the infamous Sony PlayStation 2. But with the release of the Xbox 360 in 2005, Microsoft would start to threaten Sony's dominance over the console space, with smash hit after smash hit exclusive wiping the floor with much of their competition. However, like clockwork, with the release of the Xbox One in 2013, Microsoft had embarrassed themselves right out of the gate, with anti-consumer practices and little to no worthwhile exclusives being their defining point for the entire generation. And now, in the 2020s, with the Xbox Series consoles, Microsoft is once again trying their best to get back on top. And from their perspective, this of course makes complete sense. However, it's worth noting why exactly it is that they went from being so strong during the 360 era into being so weak during the One era. Why it is, exactly, they went from having some of the best exclusives in the industry to almost nothing. And to answer that question, we need to look no further than how they treated one of my favourite studios to ever exist, Lionhead. Lionhead was a British studio that was acquired by Microsoft in the early 2000s, just as the OG Xbox was getting off. They created Fable, which to this day I still think is one of the greatest games of all time, and helped solidify the Xbox as a great platform for RPGs. And during the 360 era, they also made Fable 2, which did even better than the original. However, during the One era, Microsoft essentially forced Lionhead to make games that they didn't want to make, such as Fable Legends, an online-only service game that would never see the light of day, and Fable the Journey, a Kinect game. Yeah, really. Now, after being forced to make games that they didn't want to make, it shouldn't be too surprising that morale and thus the quality of output was low. In response, Microsoft simply flat out disbanded the company and fired everyone in the studio, only to admit many years later that they were the ones who messed up. And Lionhead isn't the only company that Microsoft has had bad relations with. After all, there's a reason why Bungie chose to go independent from them when given the chance. Microsoft was a notoriously foul boss to work under, and so it wasn't a surprise to anyone when they found themselves with barely any studios still standing. And that, ultimately, is the reason why Microsoft is now going on a spending spree, buying up all these companies, because they had either shut down or pissed off all those that they once had. This is also why Microsoft has made their consoles extremely affordable, yet still powerful, have created a service that is absolutely unrivaled, and has been seemingly making a bunch of pro-consumer decisions as of late. They want to make it clear that the possibility of the Xbox becoming the next Dreamcast has scared them, and that they've learned their lesson, and are now doing everything they can to correct the record. This has led many people, myself included, to praise Microsoft for these fantastic pro-consumer decisions. However, one has to keep in mind that Microsoft is only doing all this because they're making up for a lost generation. But what happens in 3, 4, 5 years from now when they have inevitably redeemed themselves? Well, if history teaches us anything, it's that Microsoft is a wolf in sheep's clothing. When they do poorly, they bend over backwards to serve their customers. But when they do well, they start to take them for granted and perform absurd experiments that almost always fail. It is only a matter of time before this cycle repeats again, though this time it won't just be Lionhead or Bungie that suffer, but all of their newly acquired studios. If there's anything I've tried to drill into people repeatedly on this channel, it's that in a corporate hierarchy, the only company that really matters is who's at the top. Which, following this logic, now puts all of these newly acquired companies exclusively at the will of the often out-of-touch Microsoft Executive Board of Directors. But it isn't just the inevitable downfall that irritates me, it's the consequences such acquisitions will have on their competition, aka Sony. Unlike Microsoft, Sony tends to have quite good relations with their first-party developers, hence why during the PS4 era, unlike Microsoft, they had many hits. However, the strength of the PlayStation ecosystem also relies on their third-party games. If the likes of behemoths such as Call of Duty and Elder Scrolls will no longer find themselves on their platform, they will have to make up for it one way or another. And the easiest way to do that, of course, is through yet more acquisitions. We are about to enter a new period of gaming whereby platforms shall simply buy out third-party studios to score points against their competition, something that in the past was very rare, or at the very least, small scale. This may originally be perceived by consumers as a positive. After all, competition is a good thing. However, this isn't just competition, this is consolidation. Microsoft, Apple, Sony, and all of these large multi-billion-dollar tech corporations were all started by a bunch of guys in their garage during the mid to late 20th century. This would never happen in a million years today. As today, how could a bunch of guys in their garage possibly compete with companies that make purchases that can be measured in value using countries? They simply cannot. Does anyone remember the Ouya, that awful crowd-funded console a few years back that ended up becoming a total disaster? Many people like to mock the Ouya, myself included, but frankly, the more I think about it, at least they tried. At least they tried to spice up a stagnant market that had been dominated by the same three companies for over a decade. After all, that is what real competition is. New companies. Not the same old behemoths battling it out using dollar bills. How can people not see this acquisition for what it really is? A sign that the gaming industry is heading in the exact same direction as all the other creative industries. Much like how the movie industry is dominated by a handful of studios, or how the music industry is dominated by a handful of labels, soon the gaming industry is going to be dominated by a handful of platform holders. And the once multi-platform AAA intermediaries will be borderline all but extinct, leaving only the tiniest of indie companies remaining. Now, before this acquisition can take place, the US Securities and Exchange Commission must approve it. To quote, "The SEC has a three-part mission: to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation." Well, I have to say, I fail to see how acquisitions such as these can possibly facilitate capital formation, considering if anything, they only assist in monopolising wealth into the hands of a few corporations at the expense of the many. A trend which across the entire Western world seems to never end. Then again, considering the United States, much like my own country, seems to have no problems with being a two-party state, it shouldn't surprise one in the slightest to see that it also has no problem with two companies owning half the gaming industry. I often talk about how we are entering a sort of corporate cyberpunk dystopia, and I often feel as if my words are heard by deaf ears, as if I am some sort of mad prophet screaming about the end times that will never come. And sometimes, admittedly, even I find myself wondering if perhaps I am too overly dramatic. But when I see the mindless masses clap for decisions such as these, I am only bolstered in my beliefs further. Rather than people zooming out to see the bigger picture, they instead latch onto their favourite brand of choice and either act smugly or defensively, depending on the situation. My multi-billion-dollar corporation is better than yours. No, my multi-billion-dollar corporation is. And what about my multi-billion-dollar corporation? Please, newsflash, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo don't give a flying flamingo about you. Your loyalty to these brands is doing nothing more than screwing you over. The only thing these companies care about is getting as much money as possible for their shareholders. This mass-accepted consolidation of studios will be the ultimate downfall of this industry, and the unbelievable level of compliance from both governments and consumers will ultimately be to blame.